Sometimes the clearest part of a day is the moment you remember it will not last. You are sitting at a table, the light is ordinary, then the whole scene changes. Not because anything moved, because you remember that the people here will not always be here. That is the question tonight. Not how to stop fearing death, not what happens after it. The harder question is what mortality does to life while you are still living it. Maybe death is already changing a call you postpone, a face you take for granted, a season you assume can repeat. So before we ask whether mortality gives life meaning, we have to ask what kind of clarity a limit can give without becoming comfort. By the end of tonight, I want to leave you with a cleaner way to see why mortality changes ordinary life, and why that clarity can be real without making loss acceptable. If you enjoy thinking through questions like this with us, subscribing helps others find them too. Sharing the video helps even more. Let's begin. Most of us do not spend the day thinking about death in any direct way. You make coffee, you answer a message, you leave a room half clean because you mean to come back to it later. Life mostly runs on the assumption that there will be a later, not a grand promise, just the quiet working belief that the next hour belongs to you, and then the next day, and then some wider stretch you do not have to look at too hard. That is why mortality is easy to misunderstand. We talk about it as if it were only waiting somewhere ahead, a future event, a date without a date, but that is not how it actually lives in us. It is already there when you put off the call, let the apology wait, or spend another month assuming your life will explain itself later. You can notice this even before anything dramatic happens. Two people can sit through the same meal and not really inhabit the same time. One still feels there will always be another evening of this kind. The other has begun to sense, however quietly, that nothing repeats in exactly the same form. The table is the same, the plates are the same. The conversation may even sound casual, but the second person is already living under a different scale. The hour has become less replaceable. That difference matters because mortality does not first arrive as terror. Very often it arrives as irreversibility. A sentence once spoken cannot be recalled into silence. A season once missed cannot be reopened in the same way. A parent at one age will never again be precisely that parent. You at one age will never again be precisely this version of yourself. Mortality turns ordinary time into spent time. It makes repetition look thinner than presence. And once that change in scale begins, some habits stop feeling neutral. Delay starts to look like an actual use of a life, rather than a harmless pause inside it. You can feel this without being afraid. That matters. Fear is only one way mortality enters experience. Often it comes in more quietly than that. It can show up as tenderness toward an ordinary afternoon. It can show up as a strange seriousness around a decision that used to feel reversible. It can show up when you look at your parents and realize you are not only seeing them as they are now, you are also seeing the fact that time is happening to them. The same thing happens when you catch your own face in a mirror and notice how you look, but that you have become someone through time and will keep becoming someone through time until you do not. That is the first pressure point tonight. Death is not only the final interruption, mortality is the limit already built into life as it is being lived. And once you say that clearly, a harder question follows. If mortality is already built into life, what exactly is it doing there? The usual answer is simple. It makes us anxious. It can push us into denial. It can send us toward religion, distraction, ambition, or private panic. Some of that is true. Human beings are very good at finding ways not to look straight at the limit. We keep busy. We give ourselves projects. We think in vague distances. We treat death as something that belongs to old age, hospitals, bad news, other families, another season. Even when we say the word, we often mean it in a way that keeps it abstract, but that is still not the whole story. Mortality does not only frighten, it also sharpens. Think about the difference between an afternoon that stretches without end and an afternoon you know is the last one before someone leaves. The same room can hold both. The same conversation can happen in both. The tea can be warm in the same way. The chair can sit in the same patch of light. Yet the scene does not mean the same thing. Once the limit enters view, the experience changes its weight. Details stop floating, they land. This is where the topic gets difficult, because the thought can sound almost offensive if we say it badly. If mortality sharpens life, we do not mean death is good. We do not mean loss is secretly a gift. We do not mean grief is a lesson that just needed better framing. That kind of comfort talk always arrives too quickly. It tries to rescue the subject before we have even looked at it. Most people know that instinctively. If you have sat near real loss, you know how cheap those sentences sound. They arrive too polished, too ready, as if pain were mainly a misunderstanding waiting for better wording. It is not. Sometimes the honest thing is simply to admit that mortality sharpens value while also tearing straight through the things we value. The contradiction is not a rhetorical trick, it is part of what makes the subject hard enough to matter. The better question is more exact. If you could subtract mortality from life, what would happen to the way life appears? Not what would happen to the calendar, not whether there would be more experiences, more trips, more friendships, more attempts, more unfinished books finally finished. All of that matters, but it is not the deepest point yet. The deeper point is about scale. Without the limit, would anything press on you in quite the same way? Would certain moments feel precious, or embarrassing, or final, or worth saying aloud now instead of later? Would apology still have urgency? Would affection still need courage? Would patience still count for something if everything could always be deferred? You do not need a full answer yet. Just stay with the pressure of the subtraction. Imagine a life that has every feature of yours except one. It has work, love, boredom, memory, weather, projects, family, mistakes, recovery, meals, music, the ordinary texture of being someone. But it does not have death, not later, not secretly, not waiting in the walls. The line never closes. Would that life be more meaningful because it escapes the greatest loss, or would something about meaning itself begin to thin out? It is tempting to answer too fast on either side. Some people hear the question and say of course immortality would be better. More time means more love, more understanding, more beauty, more chances to repair what was broken. Why would a limit improve anything? Others go just as quickly in the other direction. They say finitude is what gives shape to value. If everything lasted forever, nothing would matter. Death gives urgency to love, seriousness to choice, contour to the self. Both answers sound plausible because both are touching something real. It is true that mortality can intensify value. It is also true that mortality destroys what it seems to intensify. That contradiction is the whole engine of the episode. Death looks like the enemy of meaning, yet we keep speaking as if it also reveals meaning with a clarity that endless life might never provide. You can hear this in the language people use without even noticing it. They say a diagnosis changed how they saw their days. They say a funeral made trivial conflicts look absurd. They say the death of a parent changed the scale of time. They say age made certain ambitions feel hollow and certain small loyalties feel heavier. Even before philosophy begins, mortality has already rearranged the furniture of value. Still, we have to be careful here. Rearrangement is not the same as truth. A limit can force a decision without proving that the decision is wise. Scarcity can make something feel precious that is not actually good. Panic can strip life down and make us confuse intensity with clarity. So even if mortality sharpens attention, we still have to ask whether it clarifies life or only pressures us into a narrower frame. That is why the old philosophical arguments remain alive. This reaches further than fear. A wasted month starts to look different. So does the decision you keep circling without making. So does another person's presence once you know it can end. A life under no limit would not simply be a longer version of this one. It might be a different kind of thing altogether. You can test that in a painfully ordinary way. Think of the thing you keep postponing because you assume you will eventually feel more ready, not the fantasy project, the real one. The call, the apology, the medical appointment, the quiet admission that a life direction is no longer working. The only reason some of those delays remain tolerable is that the mind keeps drawing extra time from an account it has never actually seen. And that means the question of death is not only about the end, it is about the shape of the middle. You can feel that middle every time you say, "I should call them while I still can." Every time you keep a ticket stub or a voice note you would once have deleted. Every time you look back on a year and realize it did not only pass, it became unavailable, a closed door in time, not gone from memory, but gone from use. We live inside that condition whether we think about it or not. So the task is not to produce instant courage, it is to describe the condition honestly. Mortality is not only one bad event waiting at the far edge of life, it is the limit already carried by every plan, every bond, every ordinary hour, every version of yourself that is appearing and disappearing as you move through time. Once we see that, the first major philosophical response can finally come into view, because one ancient thinker looked at all this and said something almost impossible in its simplicity. Death is nothing to us. That is where we have to go next. At this point, most of us want someone to make the problem smaller. If mortality presses on everything, maybe the next step is to show that death has been given too much power in thought. That is the move Epicurus makes. He was writing in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and his argument has lasted because it is so hard to shake once you hear it cleanly. Here is the argument at its simplest. When you exist, death is not present. When death is present, you no longer exist. Death is therefore never something you experience. And if you will never experience it, what are you actually afraid of? Epicurus is not telling you to look on the bright side. He is doing something more precise. He is identifying the object of fear and pointing out that it is not the kind of object that can hurt you. Death is not a bad experience waiting to happen. It is the absence of all experience. You cannot be harmed by something you will never encounter from the inside, and encountering anything from the inside requires being alive. The argument has a very particular target. It is aimed at the picture most of us carry without realizing we carry it. The picture of death as a kind of suffering, a dark place, a cold absence you will somehow be present inside, an eternal loneliness or nothingness that you will inhabit and endure. Epicurus says that picture is wrong. Death is not a place you will inhabit. It is the disappearance of the self that does the inhabiting. There will be no one to experience the darkness. The one who was doing the experiencing will be gone. Once you hear that stated plainly, you can feel why the argument has lasted. Lucretius, a Roman poet deeply influenced by Epicurus, extended this into something that has stayed in philosophy ever since. He pointed at the symmetry. You were not alive before you were born. There was a long stretch of non-existence before this life began, and we do not spend our days grieving it. We do not feel the absence of the past centuries as a wound. We do not mourn the conversations we were not there to have, the world as it was before we arrived. That time passed, we were absent from all of it, and we accept that without distress. So why should the time after death be different? Before birth and after death are mirrors of each other. If we can sit quietly with the first, Lucretius is asking, why should the second require such horror? You can feel the pull of this. Some people, when they first hear it, feel something loosen. Others feel it is missing something they cannot quite name. Both responses deserve to be followed. Think about what you are actually picturing when you allow yourself to imagine your own death. If you look carefully, you will probably find that you are not imagining non-existence at all. Non-existence is genuinely difficult to picture. What you are more likely imagining is something closer to being trapped in darkness. Present, but unable to respond. Missing the people you love, while somehow still being aware of missing them. Being forgotten while, in some barely alive way, knowing it. Those are not pictures of death. They are pictures of suffering with the lights off. They are pictures of an ongoing life reduced to almost nothing. Epicurus is pointing at exactly that. The fear of death on his account is almost always a fear of the wrong thing. We are afraid of a continued experience of absence, and that is not what death is. Death is the ending of experience altogether. Once experience ends, there is no subject left to feel the loss. If we take his argument seriously, a real portion of the dread dissolves. Not all the anxiety around dying, not the grief of people left behind, not the sorrow about unfinished things, but the specific terror of being dead, the imagining of existing inside non-existence, of lying in the dark aware of the dark. That particular fear loses its ground, because it is a fear of something that cannot happen. And yet the argument has limits. Two of them, and they are different in kind. The first is simpler. Even if we accept that being dead involves no suffering, many people are not primarily afraid of being dead. They are afraid of dying. The process, the narrowing, the possible pain, the moment of crossing from awareness to none. Fear of dying is not the same as fear of being dead, and Epicurus is mostly addressing the second, not the first. He does offer a secondary argument about pain. Intense suffering does not last long. Lasting suffering is not intense. Whether you find that reassuring depends on what you know and what you have seen. For many people it is not enough. The process still stands as a real concern, separate from the destination. The second limit is harder, and it does not rest on fear at all. Even if death is not experienced, even if there is no subject left to suffer it, death may still be bad, not because it hurts, but because it takes. Imagine you fell asleep tonight and died painlessly, without any experience of it. No fear, no awareness, no crossing you could register, nothing. Epicurus says nothing bad happened to you. You never suffered. You will never experience the state of being dead as a hardship. The argument holds perfectly, but you would not wake up tomorrow. You would not see the people you had arranged to see. You would not complete the things you were still inside. You would miss years that were, just a few hours earlier, part of a life you were living and planning and expecting. Were you harmed? Most people feel that you were, not because you suffered, but because something was taken from you, the future you would have had, the goods of a life still in progress. Those things were real, even if they were never experienced, and a real loss does not require someone to be present for it to be a loss. This is the objection Epicurus cannot cleanly close. He has shown that death is not a form of suffering. He has not shown that death is harmless. There is a gap between those two things, and the gap matters. Taking someone's future is not the same thing as hurting someone in the present. The question of whether death deprives us of something real, something that was genuinely ours, is a different question from whether it causes suffering. And once you see that it is different, the Epicurean argument starts to look like a partial answer to a larger question. That deprivation line still has more force than it first appears. But before we leave Epicurus, we should be fair to him. He solved something. The image of death as suffering, the picture of lying in the dark, aware of the dark, the terror built from imagining an experience that is not possible, he dismantled that. He did it cleanly, and the argument holds. If you are afraid of being dead in the way you might be afraid of a painful illness, that fear is a mistake. You have added an imaginary experience to a situation that contains no experience. What he did not solve is whether death matters for other reasons. Whether the taking of a future, even without suffering, is a form of harm. Whether loss requires experience to be real. That question is still open, and once we follow it, we find that death starts to look more serious, not less. Not more frightening, but more genuinely significant. Because if death takes rather than just stops, then mortality is not only about the moment of ending, it is about everything that ending removes. The Epicurean argument was meant to free us. In a way it does. But it also clears the ground for a harder reckoning, because once we stop imagining death as a kind of suffering, we have to look at what it actually is. And what it actually is turns out to be a loss that cannot be unfelt before it arrives. The deprivation argument begins from a straightforward observation. We do not need to feel a harm for the harm to be real. Think about someone who is deceived by a close friend for years. The friend maintains a false persona, conceals genuine feelings, and the deceived person dies comfortable, never discovering any of it. Were they harmed? Most people say yes. The deception was real. The false picture of the relationship was real throughout their life. The fact that they never suffered over it, never experienced the betrayal as a wound, does not change what was true. The harm was in the condition, not in the experience of the condition. Death may work the same way. This argument was brought into sharp focus by the philosopher Thomas Nagel in an essay written in the 1970s, though versions of the thought are much older. Nagel asked a plain question: if death is harmless because it involves no suffering, what do we say about the goods it removes? Consider someone who dies at 30. Not in fear, not in pain. The death is quiet, even by the standards of the Epicurean argument, but there was a life ahead, not guaranteed in every detail, but plausible and in progress. More time with people they loved, work they were in the middle of, understanding still developing, relationships still forming. That future was part of their life, not in the sense that it had already occurred, but in the sense that it belonged to the arc of who they were and where they were going. Death removes all of it, not by causing them to experience the removal. There is no subject left to experience anything, but the goods that were within reach are simply no longer there. That is what Nagel calls deprivation. Death is bad not because it involves suffering, but because it takes from a person the life they would otherwise have had. This does something specific to the Epicurean argument. Epicurus showed us that death is not a form of suffering. Nagel is not disputing that. He is shifting the ground entirely. The badness of death does not have to live in the experience of it. It can live in the taking. You do not have to feel a loss for the loss to be real. You do not have to be present at the closing of your future for the closing to matter. Death can be a genuine harm to a person, even if that person is not around afterward to register the harm. We can press this with a thought experiment. Imagine two people. One dies at 30, unexpectedly, without pain, in their sleep. One dies at 90, also without pain, at the end of a long and fully lived life. On the Epicurean account, both deaths are equally harmless. Neither person suffers in the dying. Neither exists afterward to experience being dead. If harm requires felt suffering, these two deaths are the same. But do they seem the same? Most of us feel that there is a real difference. The person who dies at 30 loses more. Not more suffering, more life, more of the continuing texture of being someone with people and projects and years still ahead. The deprivation argument captures that intuition and gives it a reason. The 30-year-old was deprived of more future goods than the 90-year-old. And because goods can be real even when they have not yet been experienced, the size of the deprivation can vary from one death to another. That matters. It means death is not a neutral fact just because it is not painful. The badness of death is connected to what was in front of the life that ended. Now there are serious objections to this, and we should sit with them before moving on. The first, the goods that would have been experienced did not yet exist at the moment of death. They are possibilities, not actualities. Can you be deprived of something that was never real? The 30-year-old's future life never happened. It might have been long and rich, or it might have contained suffering we cannot know about. We are comparing an actual life to an imagined continuation, and imagined continuations are not solid things. Nagel acknowledges this difficulty, but the argument does not need the possible future to be a metaphysically solid object. It only needs the weaker claim that when a life is going reasonably well and could plausibly have continued, the cutting off of that continuation is a loss in the relevant sense, not a felt loss, a real one. The same way that being robbed while asleep is a real loss even if you do not wake up. The second objection is subtler. If the deprivation argument is right, does it mean that the younger you die, the worse the harm? And does it follow that death becomes progressively more acceptable the longer you live? That there is some point at which enough goods have been accumulated and death stops being a harm? Most people find those implications uncomfortable, but they are not obviously wrong. We do tend to feel that an early death is more tragic than a late one, and that there is something different about a life cut off before it had a chance to develop fully. The deprivation argument is at least trying to explain that feeling rather than dismiss it. It also makes us notice something about the way we measure a life. We often talk as if mortality were a single event with one fixed meaning. But the deprivation argument reminds us that death meets a life at different points in its unfolding. A child loses one kind of future, a young adult loses another. A person in late age may still lose much that matters, but the shape of the loss is different because more of the arc has already been lived. That does not solve anything. It only shows that the question of death's harm is tied to the texture of an actual life, not to one abstract picture of non-existence. This is why the argument can feel morally sharper than Epicurus. Epicurus gives us a cleaner thought. Nagel gives us a more entangled one. He asks us to look not only at the end point, but at the interrupted movement of a life. We know what this is like in smaller forms: a letter half written, a project that was just becoming itself, a reconciliation that had finally begun, a friendship entering a deeper phase after years of hesitation. We do not need these examples because they are dramatic. We need them because they show how often value lives in continuation. A future can already belong to a life before it arrives. That point matters for the title question tonight. If mortality clarifies, perhaps part of what it clarifies is that life is not made only of what has already happened. It is made of openings, trajectories, unfinished structures, and goods that are still gathering shape. Death does not only close a ledger, it interrupts becoming. And once you see that, the cost of death can no longer be described only in terms of pain avoided or pain endured. It has to include the silenced remainder of a life that had not yet finished saying what it was. We should be careful again here. The deprivation argument is not a license for fantasy. It does not mean every unlived possibility should be treated as if it were guaranteed to blossom. Some futures would have narrowed, some would have disappointed, some would have brought new grief. A human future is never pure profit. But that caution does not remove the basic point. A plausible future is still part of what death can take, even when we admit that no future comes without cost. What the argument does not do is comfort. This is worth naming directly. The Epicurean argument offered something like relief. If the terror of being dead is based on a mistaken picture, correcting the mistake can reduce the terror. You may still fear dying, but the specific dread of non-existence as a kind of suffering has no ground once Epicurus finishes. The deprivation argument takes away one source of anxiety and replaces it with something harder to argue away. Death may still be bad, even when it is painless. Not because it hurts, because it takes. And it takes more from some lives than others, depending on what was still ahead. This does not make life meaningless. It does not mean we should stop caring, stop attaching, stop building things we know will eventually end. But it does mean that the question of whether death matters cannot be answered simply by pointing out that it is not experienced. Something can matter in ways that do not run through experience at all. Now we are at a harder place than where we started. Epicurus tells us the specific terror of being dead is a mistake. He is right about that, and the argument holds. Nagel tells us that death can still be a genuine harm even without that terror. He is also making a serious point, and it does not collapse under the Epicurean reply. Both things can be true at the same time. Death is not a form of suffering. Death can still take something real. And once we accept that, the question of whether mortality clarifies life becomes more complicated than it first appeared. Because if death harms not by hurting but by taking, then what is it clarifying exactly? Is it clarifying what matters? Is it clarifying how much we have to lose? Or is it clarifying, in a less comfortable sense, that the life we are inside is more fragile than we hoped? Philosophers after Epicurus did not abandon the question, they moved it. Rather than asking whether death harms or whether fear of death is rational, they asked a different question. Given that death is coming, given that the future ends, what kind of person can you be inside that condition? That is where the Stoics begin, not from the angle of harm or experience, from the angle of character. What do you do with a life that has a limit? What does that limit make possible in the way you live? That question has a different kind of answer, and it leads somewhere the Epicurean argument cannot quite reach. You wake up at 2 in the morning because something small will not leave you alone. A remark somebody made, a decision you have been avoiding, the creeping sense that you are spending too much of your life on things you do not even respect. That is where the Stoics become more than a chapter in philosophy. They start from the same limit, but ask a different question. Not whether death hurts, not whether the fear is rational. What do you do with a life that will end whether or not you ever feel ready for that fact? Seneca wrote about this in his letters, hundreds of them, many addressed to a friend named Lucilius, and through him to anyone who would read. He was not writing from a comfortable distance. He wrote under threat, under a reign that would eventually order his death. He writes, "Let us prepare our minds as if we had come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day." That phrase, balance life's books, is easy to slide past, but it is doing real work. Seneca is not saying live urgently, or hustle, or seize the day as if every day might be your last in the sense of a movie trailer. He is saying something quieter. Examine what you have actually done with the day. Examine who you are inside it. If it were the last, would you have spent it well? This is a practice of attention, not an emergency. Seneca runs it daily, like a kind of discipline, the way you might keep physical condition through daily effort. For him, the mortality was not a dramatic backdrop to human life. It was the condition that makes moral seriousness possible at all. Marcus Aurelius, writing privately in the Meditations, a notebook not meant for publication, keeps returning to a similar thought, though with different emphasis. He was emperor of Rome. He had more power than nearly any person alive, and he kept writing reminders to himself about how little that mattered against the plain fact of his eventual disappearance. He writes about the people who have gone before, famous names, powerful men, none of them permanent. He writes about his own reign as a brief stretch of time inside an incomprehensible span, not to generate despair, to generate proportion. The things we compete for, worry over, protect with such care. Marcus is trying to see them clearly, and death is his main tool for doing that. That is easier to admire on the page than to practice at 2 in the morning. When you are lying awake replaying an insult, or some professional slight, or a choice that made you look smaller than you wanted to look, proportion is exactly what you lack. The mind keeps shrinking around the bruise. Marcus is useful there because he does not tell you the bruise is imaginary. He tells you it is small in a way you cannot see while pressing your face against it. What is the Stoic argument here? It is not the same as saying that death is fine, or harmless, or something to be at peace with through the correct philosophical reasoning. The Stoics are making a claim about categories. Death is an external. It is not something that belongs to the domain of what is up to us. And in the Stoic picture, your freedom and your character live entirely in the domain of what is up to you. Your judgments, your responses, the quality of attention you bring to your own life. Epicurus, who had been enslaved, put it most plainly. If you are suffering over what is external, the opinion of others, the behavior of fortune, the simple fact that your life will end, you are treating your inner life as if it was subject to forces that it is not. That misidentification is the root of most human anxiety. Death is not a threat to what you actually are. It is a limit on time. Only what you do with the time belongs to you. We might find this too clean. There is something in us that wants to say, yes, but I love specific people. I am invested in specific projects. I am trying to build specific things in the world, and all of that ends. The Stoics know this. They are not telling us not to love people or not to care about outcomes. They are telling us that the love itself, the caring itself, the full orientation of your life toward what matters, all of that is possible within a finite span. In fact, they argue it is only possible within a finite span. Here is the move that is easy to miss. The Stoics are not saying mortality is harmless. They are saying that fearing mortality at the expense of living well is the specific error to avoid. You can acknowledge the limit, hold it in view, and still choose what kind of person you are inside it. That choosing is what matters. Death is the condition of the choosing, not its enemy. Memento mori is the phrase usually attached to this practice. Remember that you will die. It has become a kind of brand, printed on notebooks, quoted in productivity threads, worn as a concept to indicate seriousness. But in its original Stoic sense, it is neither grim nor motivational. It is a recalibration tool. When the trivial presses in, when the borrowed and the small crowd out, the serious, the reminder that your time is finite clears the view. Marcus Aurelius does not sound like a man in despair when he writes about death. He sounds like a man trying hard to see clearly, over and over again, because clarity does not come naturally and has to be fought for. Death is one of the few facts large enough to do the clearing work. What the Stoics give us is not a way out of mortality. They give us a practice for living inside it, and their claim is that the practice is not grim, that holding the fact of death in daily view actually produces a lighter life, not a heavier one, because when you know what you are holding and what it is worth, you stop carrying the wrong things as if they were permanent. Seneca says it plainly, it is not that we have little time, it is that we waste most of what we have. That is not a complaint, it is a direction. The limit is already given. What you make of the interval is still up to you. The practice the Stoics recommend is not a single dramatic confrontation with mortality. It is a repeated, ordinary, daily recalibration. You are going to die. What does that mean for this day? Not as a spur to panic, as a question that keeps your priorities honest. And there is an argument in this that takes us past Epicurus. Epicurus wants to dissolve the fear by showing its target is empty. The Stoics accept that the target may not be empty, that the finitude is real, that the future ends, and they still find a way to live well inside that. Not by ignoring the limit, by using it. That is a different kind of philosophical work. And it raises a question that the next thinker in this story, writing 15 centuries later, asked in a different key. Not the philosopher ruling an empire, writing abstract principles into a notebook. A man writing, personally and directly, about what it actually feels like to approach death, and then step back from it, and then return to his desk. Before we move there, though, it is worth sitting with one final Stoic observation that resists being turned into a slogan. The Stoics do not say that a life lived well under finitude will feel different, lighter, more meaningful in some obvious way. They say that the character you build inside the limit is real, that it is the only thing that cannot be taken. Marcus Aurelius did not feel at peace with death. He felt the pull of what he had not finished, the people he would leave behind, the projects still open. What the practice gave him was not peace. It gave him clarity about what deserved his attention. That distinction matters. The Stoics are not offering emotional management. They are offering a way of looking at your own life that does not flinch from the fact of its ending. Whether that makes the ending easier, whether it changes how it feels, they are largely silent on that. What they claim is that the quality of the life itself changes when you stop treating its finite nature as an administrative inconvenience you will deal with later. The question we are building toward is not whether the Stoics are right about death, it is whether their practice, and Montaigne's, and Heidegger's, and the Buddhist versions, changes a life in any real way. Not only on the page, in the way a person speaks, chooses, delays, and pays attention. Imagine trying to get used to death on purpose. Not in order to become dramatic, not to look fearless, just because you suspect that part of the fear comes from never letting the thought come near you for long. Michel de Montaigne tried exactly that. He was a French nobleman who stepped back from public life in his late 30s and spent years writing essays, casual but serious, wandering but careful, almost always turning back to himself as the subject. He was not trying to build a system. He wanted to see what happened when he followed a thought honestly, and one of the thoughts he followed most closely was dying. He opens his most famous essay on the subject, that to philosophize is to learn to die, with the claim that all the wisdom and deliberation in the world comes back to this one task: learning how to die, not learning to be unafraid of death in some managed academic sense, actually learning to do it, to carry the knowledge of death without flinching away from it constantly. This is not so different from the Stoic project on the surface, and Montaigne was a careful reader of Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. But what he does with the Stoic material is interesting. He does not treat it as a system to adopt. He tests it on himself. His method is essayistic in the literal sense, from the French essayer, to try. He tries things out. He writes about thinking about death as a genuine experiment, not as a prescription, and this changes the register of what he is doing. He is not saying this is how one should prepare for death. He is saying, here is what happened when I tried it. That first-person honesty matters. It keeps the subject from turning into clean advice. There is a big difference between a person saying, I tested this on my own fear, and a person standing above you saying, here is the correct attitude toward dying. Montaigne is interesting partly because he never quite lets himself become that second kind of voice. What he tried, following the Stoics and several ancient sources, is the practice of making death familiar. He recommends going to places where dying is visible, places where old people and sick people go, where the reality of the body's ending is less concealed than it normally is. He recommends thinking about death regularly, not as a meditation exercise or a spiritual discipline, but as a way of loosening the shock of it. His argument for this is pragmatic. Death's terror comes partly from its unfamiliarity. We keep it out of sight, talk around it, postpone thinking about it, and so when it actually approaches, in illness, in the death of someone close, or in the approach of old age, we are ambushed by something we should have been getting used to all along. The practice of thinking about death reduces the ambush. It makes the encounter less surprising. There is a thought experiment here that Montaigne does not quite state explicitly, but that runs through the essay. What would it mean to think about your own death tonight? Not with dread, not as a morbid exercise, but the way you might think about a difficult journey you know you will one day take, just as a fact to sit with. The journey is coming. What is the best way to prepare? But Montaigne adds something that the Stoics do not quite give us, and it comes from an accident. In the 1580s, he was badly injured in a riding accident. He was thrown from his horse, hit the ground hard, and for a period believed he was dying. He writes about the experience in unusual detail. What he found, in that moment when he thought death had arrived, was that it was not as he had expected. The fear he had anticipated, the panic, the resistance, was largely absent. He felt a kind of detachment that surprised him. He writes that nature takes over, that the body begins its work of closing down with more grace than we imagined, that the approaching end did not feel like the violent rupture he had always pictured. This is not a near-death mysticism. He is not claiming some vision or spiritual revelation. He is making a narrower observation. The anticipation of dying may be much worse than the experience of it. The fear is in the imagination. The event itself may be quieter. This is a strange kind of comfort. It does not resolve the deprivation argument. Whether death harms by taking a future is not addressed by the observation that the process of dying may be less terrible than expected. But it does something to the texture of the fear. If the terror is partly a product of imagination, of how vividly we can picture our own ending, then the practice of making death familiar is also, in a way, a practice of discipline over the imagination. Montaigne is not the first person to notice that fear of death is often fear of how death will feel. We can imagine it as a tearing, a violent rupture, something fought against. We imagine ourselves aware of what is being lost, desperate to hold it. His accident showed him a different possibility, that the body has its own way of managing the transition, that the narrative we construct about our ending may be much more violent than the ending itself. There is a philosophical question buried in this observation that Montaigne does not fully excavate. If the fear of death is partly a misrepresentation, a picture we build in imagination that does not match the event, then some part of what makes mortality a source of anxiety might be soluble not by philosophy, but by a more accurate picture. Not a consoling picture, a truer one. But Montaigne is honest enough not to push this too far. He had one riding accident. He does not know what dying will actually be like when it arrives at the end of his life. The experience he describes is of nearly dying at a specific moment, with specific injuries, at a specific age. It is evidence, not proof. He offers it as a data point, not a doctrine. What makes Montaigne valuable in this conversation is exactly this modesty about what he knows. He does not claim to have solved the problem. He claims to have looked at it directly, to have had his expectations overturned once, and to have learnt something partial and provisional from the experience. That is not a small thing. Most people in his period, and most people now, avoid the direct confrontation Montaigne is describing. They manage the knowledge of death at a distance. He brought it close and reported back. Montaigne does not stay in one place on this subject. His later essays are less severe, less urgent about the mortality practice. He becomes more interested in living comfortably in the present. He writes that he no longer wants to think about death so much, that he has other things to attend to, that the preparation he did earlier is perhaps enough. He is not consistent, and he does not apologize for it. Consistency was not his project. And this inconsistency is philosophically honest in a way that a more systematic thinker might not allow, because the experience of carrying the knowledge of death changes across a life. What works for a 40-year-old thinking about mortality in the abstract does not feel exactly the same as the relationship an 80-year-old has with the same fact. Montaigne allows for this. The practice is not one thing applied once and settled. It is something you return to differently as the life changes around it. What Montaigne gives us is the personal register that the Stoics tend to abstract away from. He is not telling us what a reasonable person should do in relation to mortality. He is telling us what he tried, what he found, what surprised him, and where he ended up. It is testimony, not prescription, and the effect is to make the mortality question feel livable, not solved, not dissolved, but something a person can actually move around in, return to, and revise. We are building toward the question the video is asking: does mortality make life clearer? Montaigne's essay does not answer it directly, but it suggests something. The practice of bringing death close, however it is done, does seem to change what is visible. The things that recede when you hold the limit in view, the things that become more themselves, the way a specific afternoon can feel different when you hold the fact that it will not repeat. These are what the various mortality practices have in common. The question is whether what they are showing us is genuinely clarity, or whether, when life becomes vivid under the pressure of mortality, we are seeing something true, or only something more intense. That distinction is where the next thinker enters the conversation. And he enters it at a different angle entirely. Not from Rome, not from a French country house, not from practical Stoic exercises, from the inside of a philosophical inquiry that tried to think about death as systematically as possible, and found that it could not be kept at arm's length. There are moments when mortality does not feel like an idea at all. It feels like your own name getting louder inside your life. A parent gets sick. Someone your age dies. You look around at the routine you have built, and suddenly it stops feeling neutral. That is the angle Heidegger cares about. Not first what you should do with death, what death shows you about the life that is already yours before you start trying to manage it. That shift matters, because sometimes what unsettles you is not only that you will die, it is that the fact of your death keeps making your life feel more personal than you would always like it to feel. You can share work, love, family, custom, belief, language, even grief. But you cannot hand your ending to someone else. No one can die your death in your place. That is the pressure Heidegger wants to name. He does not begin from advice, he begins from structure. We usually live in ways that let us slide outward. We live by routines, roles, opinions, obligations, habits, expectations. We speak in the language everyone already has ready for us. We tell ourselves what people do, what one says, what one worries about, what one plans for later. Much of that is ordinary and necessary. It is how life works, but it also lets you hide from the fact that your life is not a generic life. It is yours, and one reason it is yours is that it ends in a way no one else can take over. This is why Heidegger's phrase, being toward death, is easy to misunderstand. It does not mean enjoying dark thoughts. It does not mean performing seriousness. It does not mean thinking about funerals all day, or trying to cultivate a dramatic personality around mortality. It also does not mean carrying a permanent mood of fear. It means that death is not only one future event among others, it is the limit that silently shapes every possible future you imagine. You can plan a trip, delay a conversation, change careers, move cities, repair a friendship, waste a year, begin again. All of that remains open only within a life that is not endless. Death is the closing horizon around all your possibilities. That does not tell you exactly what to do, but it does tell you something about the kind of being you are. You are not simply a thing with properties. You are a life stretched forward into possibilities that will not remain open forever. That is why mortality can make life feel clearer. Not because death kindly explains your values, not because finitude gives you a neat moral lesson, but because the fact that time is not indefinite has a way of stripping away the illusion that you can be everything, keep everything, delay everything, or remain indefinitely unfinished without cost. Heidegger thinks most of us spend a lot of time protected from that recognition. We stay absorbed in busyness, in tasks, in distraction, in what people around us seem to treat as urgent, in inherited scripts about success, adulthood, responsibility, achievement, usefulness, respectability. None of that is fake, but it can become a way of living without really owning the life being lived. Death interrupts that comfort, not always by arriving physically, but by making the borrowed version of life harder to sustain. You may know this feeling already. A certain age arrives. A parent gets sick. Someone you knew dies too young. A diagnosis appears. A child is born. A quiet afternoon suddenly feels exposed, and something shifts. The life that seemed to stretch forward in a vague open line now starts to look bounded. Not finished, bounded. That can be frightening, but it can also be clarifying, because once you really feel that your time is yours in a limited way, some borrowed priorities start to lose their authority. Not all at once, not cleanly, but enough that the voice of later loses some of its magic. This is one reason Heidegger's language of authenticity attracts people. He is trying to name a life that is not lived only by drifting with what everyone else already counts as normal. But here we have to be careful. Authenticity in this sense is not a lifestyle brand. It is not permission to become theatrical, selfish, or proudly unconventional. It is not being true to yourself in the shallow modern sense, where the self is assumed to be obvious and fully waiting inside you. What Heidegger is after is harder and less flattering. He is asking what it means to live without hiding from the fact that your possibilities are finite and that no one else can answer for that finitude on your behalf. That can make a life feel more serious. But serious is not the same as noble. In fact, one uncomfortable thing about this view is that death individualizes without comforting. The Stoics gave you a practice. Montaigne gave you a companionable voice. Heidegger gives you less warmth than either of them. He is not trying to soothe you. He is trying to take away one of your easiest illusions, that your life can remain indefinitely general. This is where the word Ownmost starts to matter. Heidegger uses it to say that death belongs to you in a peculiar way, not because you own it like property, not because you can control it. Quite the opposite. You cannot master it, but it is still your limit in a way no role, no institution, no crowd, and no loved one can absorb. That is why mortality can force a kind of honesty. If no one can die for you, then no one else can fully live your life for you either. That sentence can sound obvious. It is not obvious when you follow it through. It means that some forms of waiting are not neutral. Some postponements are choices. Some identities are borrowed longer than they should be. Some ambitions survive only because you have not yet looked at the cost of keeping them alive. Some resentments continue because you imagine time as more available than it is. Some relationships remain half-lived because you keep treating your own life as if it were still in rehearsal. Death does not solve any of that, but it can make it harder to lie about it. This is one way mortality makes life clearer. It does not tell you what matters in the sense of giving you a final list. It tells you that evasion has a price. That is a different kind of clarity, and it helps explain why people sometimes emerge from an encounter with death, or with the possibility of death, feeling less confused without feeling happier. What has become clearer is not necessarily the answer. It is the fact that life cannot be lived indefinitely by deferral. There is another important part of Heidegger's view. Death is not only certain, it is indefinite. You know it is coming, but not when. That matters. If the date were fixed and visible, your life would organize itself around a countdown. But actual mortality does not usually work that way. It is near in principle and uncertain in timing. So being toward death is not about waiting for a date. It is about living under a condition that may matter at any time without becoming paralyzed by that fact. That is hard. It means clarity will never come in a perfectly stable form. You can feel it and lose it. You can see what matters and drift again. You can make one brave choice while still hiding in 10 smaller ways. Heidegger is not promising a clean transformation. He is describing a structure you can either meet honestly or keep covering over. And that is why his account can feel both severe and true. Death does not become harmless. It does not become good. It does not become a motivational slogan. It becomes the limit that keeps reminding you that your life is not interchangeable. For some people, that thought is too stark to live with for long. They want consolation, not structure. And that want is not shallow. It is deeply human. So the next question has to be different. If mortality individualizes and clarifies, can it also be answered with comfort? Or does any real consolation risk softening the truth we have just been given? There are times when clarity is not enough. You can understand something about your life and still feel crushed by it. You can see that time is limited, that borrowed priorities are thin, that delay has a cost, that no one can live for you, and still find that none of this helps when loss, fear, humiliation or uncertainty actually enters the room. That is where consolation becomes a real philosophical question. Not as decoration, not as comfort talk after the serious part is over. As a test, if mortality clarifies, what kind of clarity can a human being live with? Boethius enters here from a very different place than Heidegger. He is not writing as an abstract analyst of existence. He is writing from collapse. Once powerful, well-educated, and politically central, he is arrested, cut off, disgraced, and waiting in prison for death. The consolation of philosophy begins there. He is not composing a calm handbook. He is trying to think while his life is falling apart. That is important because it changes what consolation means. It is no longer a pleasant idea added from outside. It is the question of what can still be said when the things that made your life feel stable have already begun to disappear. Boethius stages this as an encounter with Lady Philosophy, who comes not mainly to soothe him, but to correct him. That can sound strange to us now, but the structure is familiar. When you are in pain, one part of you wants tenderness. Another part wants someone to tell you the truth without flinching. Boethius gives himself both, though not evenly. The consolation he receives is not first a promise that his suffering is small. It is a challenge to the beliefs that made him think his good life rested on unstable things. That is the first move. What did you take to be yours that was never secure enough to carry your peace? Fortune is Boethius' great theme, because fortune names the instability of everything we usually lean on without admitting it. Status, wealth, praise, security, recognition, political position, health, influence, even the continuity of a certain public identity, all of these can look solid while they are with you. Then a reversal comes, and you discover they were always on loan. This is not a new thought. Most people know it in outline, but Boethius forces it much harder. He is asking what happens when you stop treating that instability as an unfortunate exception and start seeing it as part of the condition under which you were living all along. That matters for our question because mortality is the widest form of this instability. Death does not only take one good among others, it reveals that every worldly good was already vulnerable before death arrived. Your plans were vulnerable. Your position was vulnerable. Your body was vulnerable. Your reputation was vulnerable. The future version of yourself you were counting on was vulnerable. So consolation cannot mean pretending those goods were never worth loving. That would be false and inhuman. But it also cannot mean acting shocked that fragile things turned out to be fragile. That is the discipline Boethius tries to impose. And this is where he becomes uncomfortable in a useful way, because many of us want consolation that leaves our ordinary dependencies intact. We want to be reassured without having our scale of value disturbed. We want someone to say yes, love your life exactly as you do, trust the same structures, seek the same recognition, rest your peace in the same places, and simply suffer less when they fail. Boethius does not grant that wish. He thinks consolation requires reordering. You cannot be consoled at the deepest level if you are still treating unstable goods as if they were final goods. That is a strong claim. You may resist it. You probably should resist part of it, because there is something severe here, maybe too severe. Human beings do not only suffer because we mistake temporary things for eternal ones. We suffer because temporary things really matter. A friend is not less dear because they are mortal. A child is not less precious because they can be lost. A life project is not trivial because it can fail. Love does not become a philosophical error just because it exposes you to grief. So if Boethius is going to help us, it cannot be by asking us to become indifferent in the flat sense. What he can offer is something narrower and more plausible. He can show that mortality becomes more crushing when you have built your whole self on goods that cannot stay. That is a thought many people discover the hard way. If your identity rests entirely on being admired, one reversal can hollow you out. If your sense of worth rests entirely on being needed, one change in circumstance can make life feel blank. If your peace depends on the future unfolding exactly as imagined, mortality will not be the only threat to it. Ordinary contingency will keep injuring you too. In that sense, consolation is connected to death not only because death ends life, but because death exposes how much of life was already being held together by unstable arrangements. That is clarifying in a painful way, and it can be clarifying before anything catastrophic happens. You may notice, for example, that some of your fear of death is actually fear of losing role, control, unfinished plans, witness, audience, or status. That does not make the fear unreal, but it tells you something about what you have tied yourself to. The fear becomes a lens. Boethius wants to use that lens to separate what can be taken from what should not be treated as entirely takeable. His own answer finally becomes theological and metaphysical in ways that not every modern viewer will follow. He ultimately wants stability in the highest good, not in fortune. If you do not share that framework, some of the argument will feel distant. But even then, the structure of the question remains powerful. Where have you placed your peace? What losses would reveal that you had built too much of yourself on what cannot hold? What kind of clarity does fear give you about your attachments before death ever arrives? These are not small questions, and they may explain why mortality sometimes makes life clearer by making your hierarchy visible. What you dread losing tells you what has become central. What you cannot imagine surrendering tells you where your self has settled. What you keep postponing tells you which goods you still assume time will protect. In that sense, death does not only stand at the end, it keeps interrogating the middle. Now Boethius also helps us see the limits of consolation. Some truths can be lived with more calmly once your attachments are reordered. But that does not mean every sorrow dissolves. Philosophy is not a solvent that removes grief. It can reveal confusion. It can calm panic. It can loosen false dependencies. It can remind you that fortune was never obedience. But it cannot make loss stop mattering. That is why the argument has to stay honest. Consolation is not the cancellation of pain. It is a way of making pain less chaotic by placing it inside a truer picture of what you were depending on. That is why Boethius still matters, even for people who do not share his final metaphysics. He forces a question many modern people would rather postpone. If fear of death ruins your peace, what else was already holding your peace together too weakly? Was it praise, continuity, being needed, the assumption that your public role and your private worth were the same thing? Mortality becomes sharper when it lands on a self built from unstable materials. The blow is not only the fact that you will die, it is the discovery that you had asked temporary structures to do the work of a lasting center. We know versions of this without prison walls. A change in health alters what you thought your body quietly guaranteed. A professional fall exposes how much of your confidence depended on being seen in a certain way. A rupture in love reveals how much identity had been built around an arrangement you thought would keep holding. These are not full equivalents of death, but they belong to the same grammar of vulnerability. They show that what we call mortality is woven into a wider field of instability long before the final event arrives. Seen this way, consolation becomes less like a soothing speech and more like a forced rearrangement of scale. What can be loved without being mistaken for a foundation? What can be enjoyed without being treated as a guarantee? What kind of inner order remains when fortune stops cooperating? Boethius does not answer those questions gently. He answers them by stripping the sufferer of flattering confusion. That severity is part of his value. Sometimes the kindest thing philosophy can do is refuse to help us lie about what was fragile from the beginning. Still, we should not let severity become contempt for ordinary human attachment. That would betray the very pressure that brought Boethius to philosophy in the first place. He writes because the losses are real, because humiliation is real, because the collapse of worldly goods can genuinely shatter a person. Consolation only matters if the wound matters. So the best use of Boethius here is not to teach coldness. It is to ask whether there is any way to love unstable goods without turning them into idols that must never fail. That question reaches beyond prison and beyond theology. It reaches into every ordinary life that keeps leaning on what cannot finally hold. Mortality clarifies because it asks again and again whether your peace depends on what time, luck, illness, betrayal, and death can remove. If it does, then the work is not to stop loving the world. It is to stop asking the world for promises it cannot make. For some people, that is enough to breathe differently. For others, it is still too cold. And maybe that is because a large part of mortality's clarity does not come from comfort at all. It comes from seeing more sharply what remains when comfort is weak. That brings us to another tradition entirely, not one that asks how to console the self by securing a higher good, but one that asks whether the self and its losses were ever as stable as we took them to be in the first place. You have probably had the experience of trying to keep something in place by caring about it harder. A season of life, a version of yourself, a relationship exactly as it was when it still felt safe, a role that once made sense. You can feel it changing, and part of you responds by tightening. You rehearse what it meant. You revisit what was said. You look for some promise that this can stay what it has been. And very often that tightening does not protect the thing. It only makes the loss sharper. That is where another answer to mortality begins, not with death as one future event, with the thought that almost all of our suffering already comes from trying to hold still what does not stay still. In Buddhist thought, impermanence is not a dramatic discovery. It is the ordinary condition we keep resisting. Everything composite changes, feelings pass, bodies age, relationships shift, moods rise and fall, roles are gained and lost. Even the self we try to defend as fixed is less settled than it first appears. Death matters here, of course, but it matters as the most complete expression of a fact that was already true long before the final moment. Nothing we live inside is stable in the way we want it to be. That can sound obvious when said too quickly. Everyone knows things change. But Buddhist thought pushes much harder than that casual sentence usually does. It is not only telling you to accept that time passes, it is asking you to look at how much of your distress comes from demanding permanence from things that were never built to give it. That demand shows up everywhere. You want a moment to stay meaningful without fading. You want love to stay untouched by time. You want your body to stay recognizable. You want your plans to survive contact with reality. You want the people you love to remain available inside the shape your life has already learned. And when the world refuses, it can feel as if life has betrayed you. Buddhist impermanence answers that feeling in a severe way. It says the betrayal may not come from change itself. It may come from the picture of reality you were trying to live inside. That does not make loss easy. It does not tell you not to love. It does not ask you to become cold. What it does is expose a habit of mind. We suffer once because things pass. Then we suffer again because we keep asking passing things to behave like possessions. That second suffering is crucial, because it changes the question from how do I stop loss to what in me keeps turning changing things into objects I think I can secure. Now, mortality enters the picture differently from the earlier chapters. Epicurus tried to calm fear by saying death is nothing to us. Nagel argued that death can still harm us by taking away future goods. The Stoics trained us to remember death so that we would stop living carelessly. Montaigne wanted familiarity. Heidegger wanted us to stop hiding in the anonymous future. Boethius asked what kind of consolation can survive the collapse of worldly stability. Buddhist impermanence shifts the whole angle. Maybe death clarifies life because death is not the only instability we face. Maybe it clarifies because it brings to its sharpest point a truth that was already present in every attachment, every plan, every identity, every ordinary afternoon you wanted to keep from moving. That is why this view can feel both liberating and difficult. It is liberating because it loosens a struggle you may have mistaken for love. Sometimes what we call love is mixed with refusal. We do not only cherish a person, we also want them not to change, not to leave, not to become unreachable, not to reveal that they were never ours to keep in the first place. The same is true of our own lives. You may not only want to live well, you may want your life to stay legible to you. You may want your future self to confirm the story your present self is telling. Mortality threatens that story. Impermanence says the threat began much earlier. This is where Buddhist thought can sound, at first, almost too severe. If everything passes, what becomes of commitment? If the self is unstable, what becomes of responsibility? If attachment hurts, what becomes of love? Those are fair questions, and bad versions of this idea answer them by becoming soft and vague. They turn impermanence into a wellness slogan. Everything changes, so just breathe and let go. That is much thinner than the philosophy itself. The stronger point is not that nothing matters because everything passes. It is that things matter differently once you stop treating permanence as the hidden condition of their value. A moment does not become meaningless because it ends. A person does not become unreal because you cannot keep them. A life does not become worthless because it is exposed to change. What becomes harder to defend is the fantasy that meaning requires possession. That fantasy also shapes identity. Many of us cling not only to people and plans, but to a story about who we are supposed to be. We want continuity of self in a way that feels clean and administratively manageable. We want to say, this is who I am, this is what matters to me, this is the stable outline that time will merely fill in, but life keeps disturbing that outline. Desire changes, beliefs change, capacities change, loss changes the person who undergoes it. Buddhist thought does not ask us to celebrate this instability. It asks us to stop pretending that our suffering begins only when instability becomes undeniable. It began much earlier, in the demand that the self remain fixed enough to be owned. And once that fantasy begins to weaken, mortality can stop looking like the one great vandal entering an otherwise stable house. It starts to look more like the final confirmation of a condition we were always living in. That does not remove grief, but it can remove a certain kind of shock. The shock that comes from believing, however quietly, that the important things were supposed to stay. In Buddhist language, clinging is not simply caring, it is the tightening that tries to turn the flowing structure of life into something ownable. And because life refuses that conversion, clinging produces frustration, fear, and repeated disappointment. Death becomes the most painful case, but not the only case. You can see why this would clarify life. If you really take impermanence seriously, a great deal of delay begins to look strange. Why postpone attention to the people you love? Why build your days around resentments that cannot hold? Why organize your life around the fantasy of a later moment when everything will finally become secure enough to begin living properly? Impermanence does not only humble possession, it also attacks postponement. And that brings it very close to mortality. Because one reason death sharpens life is that it strips credibility from the idea that reality will wait for you. Buddhist thought says reality was never waiting. It was already moving while you were bargaining with it. This is why practices such as maranasati, recollection of death, are not mainly theatrical confrontations with the grave. They are exercises in seeing through the everyday trance in which we keep assigning unlimited extension to a world that plainly does not have it. The point is not to become haunted. The point is to become less deceived, less likely to waste a week in emotional bargaining with what has already changed, less likely to confuse care with control, less likely to treat delay as though it were a harmless neutral zone. Still, the argument needs one caution. Impermanence can be misunderstood as a command to stay detached from everything. But a life without care is not the point. The point is a different relation to care, one that loves without building a private theory of possession around what it loves. That is much harder than it sounds, because we often discover only late that what we called acceptance was numbness, and what we called commitment was hidden control. Impermanence is difficult partly because it asks for a third thing, not indifference, not clinging, a steadier form of care that does not deny change and does not collapse into passivity before it. And it leads to a final question. If mortality does not only frighten us, but also shows us where we have been clinging, then what exactly does it clarify when we finally stop arguing with it? It usually begins with an ordinary sentence. I should call him tonight. We cannot keep talking to each other like this. If I keep living this way, the years are going to vanish inside it. Those thoughts do not arrive because you finally solved death as an idea. They arrive because, for a moment, time stops feeling disposable. You are driving home, or rinsing a glass, or standing in the kitchen after everyone else has gone to bed. And something you had been managing as a distant fact comes close enough to change the room. Not into drama, into proportion. You see where you have been pretending. You see what keeps getting moved into later. You see how much of your peace depends on assumptions you never meant to examine. That is the turn we have been following all night. Mortality does not only frighten, it exposes. It exposes the life you are living on credit. The promise that there will be plenty of time to repair this, plenty of time to become clearer, plenty of time to stop giving your days away to things you do not even respect. Death did not invent those habits. It makes them harder to romanticize. A week stops looking spare. A year stops looking easy to recover. A silence between two people stops looking minor just because no one has named it. You begin to feel edges that were already there. Then the scale changes. The argument that consumed an afternoon may still matter, but not like the apology you have postponed for half a year. The busy task may still need doing, but its noise no longer proves it deserves the life it is taking. That is one kind of clarity. Another is quieter. A day can be packed and still feel wasted in a way that is difficult to admit. Messages answered, chores finished, small irritations managed, small pleasures consumed, and then night arrives, and if someone asked what truly deserved you in those hours, you would have to pause longer than you want to. Mortality sharpens that pause, not because every hour must become profound, because finitude makes it harder to confuse being occupied with being faithful. That distinction matters more than it first appears. A person can be intensely occupied and still be avoiding the few things that would make the occupation honest. You can be useful to everyone except the person you keep disappointing. You can be reliable in public and evasive in the one room where truth would cost you something. You can have a full calendar and a strangely empty sense of allegiance, because the day has been arranged around demands without ever asking which demands deserve your life. Mortality does not solve that confusion. It does not give you a ranking system for every possible duty, but it does make the evasion more visible. It asks why the urgent thing keeps winning over the important thing. It asks why the person you love receives the tired remainder of you while strangers receive your cleanest attention. It asks why the apology is always scheduled for a calmer week, as if calm were guaranteed to arrive before absence does. This is not a call to live theatrically. The finite life does not need to become a performance of intensity. In fact, that is one of the ways people misunderstand death. They imagine clarity as a demand to burn everything down, confess everything at once, chase every desire before the clock closes. But the clearer life may be quieter than that. It may mean answering the message while the care is still alive. It may mean refusing one unnecessary cruelty. It may mean admitting that a relationship cannot be repaired by indefinitely appearing agreeable. The point is not that mortality turns every small choice into a monument. The point is that repeated small choices are where a life quietly takes its shape. And if that sounds severe, it is also merciful. You do not have to wait for a grand crisis to see what deserves more of you. The evidence is already in the way you spend attention, withhold truth, return to people, and let ordinary days testify for or against what you say you value. It changes love too. Without noticing, we slide from love into possession. My friend, my partner, my father, my place in the world. Ordinary words, but they can hide a quiet entitlement, as if the people who steady us are slowly becoming part of our furniture. You see it in ordinary home life. Someone walks through the door and you barely look up because you assume the evening is still wide open. A friend calls and you let it ring because tomorrow feels guaranteed enough. Your father repeats a story and you hear inconvenience before you hear the person. Nothing about that sounds severe. That is exactly why it spreads so easily. A life is rarely damaged only by its obvious mistakes. Just as often it is thinned out by these tiny permissions, by the casual way affection gets pushed behind mood, routine, and the fantasy of unlimited later. Mortality breaks that illusion. The people closest to you are not fixtures in your private design. They are living presences. They can be cherished, neglected, misread, lost. Think of a father standing in a doorway while you answer him from another room, already half gone in your mind. Think of a friend sending a long message you mean to answer carefully, then watching 3 days close over it. Think of the person you love sitting across from you at dinner while your attention keeps flickering back to a screen you insist is temporary. That can feel cruel. It can also make you more exact. And exactness is one of the hardest gifts mortality gives. Once you stop assuming the important things are securely yours, some habits stop looking harmless. The way work swallows your speech, the way you keep certain people at the edge of your life while insisting they matter, the way your stated values and your actual days keep failing to meet. That mismatch is clarifying. Maybe that is one reason people avoid death so stubbornly, not only because it is frightening, because it is revealing. It asks embarrassingly plain questions. What keeps getting your best attention? What have you been handing your life to without ever naming the trade? What are you still postponing your seriousness for? Underneath that is an even deeper correction. Mortality separates value from permanence. We keep acting as if something only fully counts if it can be kept. If a relationship ends, was it real enough? If a person dies, did the goodness somehow become less good? If a work remains unfinished, Was it wrong to begin? But finite life keeps pushing back. A conversation can matter without being saved. A loyalty can matter without becoming permanent. A love can matter without becoming safe. Death does not make that easy. It does make our hunger for guarantees look less wise. And that is why clarity is not the same thing as peace. Sometimes clarity feels like shame, sometimes like grief, sometimes like the cold recognition that the life you are living is arranged around things you would struggle to defend if someone asked you plainly. Mortality can wound and instruct at the same time. It can make life feel smaller because it limits it, and more vivid because it forces distinction. Still, none of this is automatic. Some people meet mortality and become kinder. Some become controlling. Some become honest. Some become panicked. Death does not ennoble anyone by itself. It just removes a few hiding places. That is why philosophy matters here. Not because it defeats death, because it helps us recognize what death has already uncovered. False delay, false possession, false stability, false priorities. Once those begin to loosen, the next question is unavoidable. If those excuses fall away, what kind of life is left standing? Some ways of spending a life only feel reasonable if you keep assuming there will be plenty more of it. You postpone the conversation because next month feels available. You stay loyal to a version of yourself you already know is finished. You keep serving obligations you never chose because changing course would be inconvenient. You tell yourself you will be more honest later, more serious later, more loving later, less afraid later. As long as later feels spacious, those delays barely look like delays. They look like maturity, patience, responsibility, good timing. That is why mortality matters here. Not because it commands panic, because it makes your best excuses sound thinner. Once finitude is no longer just a background fact, certain habits begin losing their dignity. Not in one dramatic revelation, more like a smell you cannot stop noticing once it is in the room. The resentment you keep polishing, the relationship you remain inside without speaking honestly, the work you still call necessary long after it became a refuge from a harder decision, the private story in which your real life has not quite started yet. People go on doing these things. Mortality does not magically stop them. It changes their cost. You can feel that cost even before anything breaks. There is a private embarrassment in knowing you are spending a life in ways you would not defend out loud. You keep scrolling, keep smoothing over the same tension, keep calling your numbness busyness because the other description would require a change. Mortality gives those habits less room to hide behind neutral language, and the cost is not measured only in years. It is measured in evenings surrendered without thought. In the number of times you say yes because choosing would expose you. In the number of chances you keep treating as if they will return unchanged. This is where it helps to stay plain. Death does not hand you a perfect answer. It does not tell you which city to leave, which work to keep, which friendship to release, or what deserves the next 10 years of your life. But it does ruin a certain style of pretending. The style where you keep translating your own reluctance into noble language. You call it patience when you are afraid to disappoint someone. You call it prudence when you already know the arrangement is hollow. You call it loyalty when the deeper truth is that you do not want the upheaval that honesty would bring. Almost everyone does this somewhere, not because they are uniquely weak, because a finite life is still long enough to build impressive camouflage around one avoided decision. Years can disappear that way, not in visible catastrophe, in managed postponement. Whenever philosophy pretends mortality turns every choice into a neat diagram, it starts lying. Usually mortality does something rougher. It removes a few excuses while leaving the real difficulty intact. You still may not know what the right choice is, but you know more clearly when you are hiding from the choice. That is already a serious change. In ordinary life, this becomes almost embarrassingly visible. You wake up, answer messages, complete tasks, make yourself busy, and call that a day. By evening, you have solved 10 small problems, and still cannot say whether the day went anywhere a human life should go. Mortality does not make busyness disappear. It asks whether busyness has become your method for never judging the life underneath it. That is hard, partly because modern life offers endless respectable distractions. You can lose whole years in side things that do not even look frivolous. Duty can hide avoidance. Ambition can hide fear. Planning can hide refusal. Even self-improvement can hide the unwillingness to begin where you already are. Mortality presses on all of that, not by saying every hour must be optimized. That is only panic in a sharper suit. The point is simpler. If time is limited, the structure of your attention matters. What keeps receiving your clearest energy? What always gets deferred? What do you keep claiming to care about while arranging your days around something else? Those are not productivity questions. They are allegiance questions. What has your life already pledged itself to, even if you have never said it aloud? Once mortality enters the room, those hidden pledges become easier to read. You may find that you are serving comfort where you claimed to be serving truth, or approval where you claimed to be serving freedom, or habit where you claimed to be serving love, or image where you claimed to be serving substance. Then the ordinary parts of life get heavier: how you answer a message, how you speak when tired, whether you keep a promise no one can force you to keep, whether you stay in the room when someone is trying, badly, to tell you the truth, whether you keep turning something into a joke when what is needed is an apology. Mortality does not make these acts glamorous. It makes them readable. A life is not formed only by big turning points. It is formed by repeated small submissions, repeated small refusals, repeated small permissions. That matters because many of us keep imagining seriousness as a future event, one decisive season in which we finally become who we mean to be. Mortality weakens that fantasy. The person you are becoming is already visible in what you keep doing when no grand test is present. That can feel discouraging. It can also be bracing. If your life is being shaped now, then now is not rehearsal. Now is part of the thing itself. That is why mortality can sound accusatory, not because it asks for heroics, because it asks whether the life you are living can bear your own honest inspection. And the answer will mostly be found in ordinary acts: telling the truth sooner, showing up when it is inconvenient, refusing petty cruelties, protecting attention, noticing what matters before it has to be mourned. The ordinary does not become less important under finitude. It becomes more important because the ordinary is where a life is actually spent. This is also where philosophy shows its limit. You can understand every argument in this episode and still go back to the same evasions tomorrow. You can know later is uncertain and keep offering your life to delay anyway. You can have one clear week after a funeral and then feel the old arrangement of your attention quietly reassemble itself. That does not refute the point. It is the point. Human beings do not become answerable once and for all. We forget, we drift, we cover things over again. That is why so many traditions made mortality a practice instead of a conclusion. The reminder has to return often enough that clarity becomes habit and not just mood. So the life that remains when delay stops working is not a dramatic reinvention. It is a life less willing to waste itself on what even it cannot defend. A life less likely to assume the future will rescue the present from cowardice. A life that begins, however imperfectly, to line up what it says matters with what it repeatedly gives itself to. There is no guarantee that this sticks. You can see all of it and still hide again by Tuesday. That is not unusual. It is human difficulty. We become clearer, then forget, then remember. The work is repeated, and once you see that, another pressure enters. If death changes how you spend your life, what does it do to how you love the people you cannot keep? It is one thing to say mortality changes priorities. It is another to admit what it does to love, because this is where calm philosophy starts getting personal. You can speak cleanly about finitude. You can agree that all things pass. You can even repeat that clinging brings suffering. Then one face enters the picture, one voice, one person whose continued presence has become part of the structure of your day. And suddenly mortality is no longer a lesson about perspective. It is a threat to attachment where attachment is deepest. That is exactly why this matters. If mortality clarifies life, it has to clarify love too. And love does not meet death in one pure form. Sometimes what mortality reveals is painful because it shows how mixed our love already was. You loved the person. Of course you did. But you also loved the way their presence held part of your world together. Their place in the room, their voice at the usual hour, the future in which they were already built. When mortality enters that picture, it exposes something we would rather not say. Part of what we love is not only the person, but the continuity they give our life. That does not make the love false. It makes it human. Most love is mixed. There is care, gratitude, recognition, delight, and also fear, need, the hope that this arrangement will keep holding. Mortality makes that mixture harder to deny. This is one reason grief is so disorienting. Someone does not only disappear from the present, a whole structure of expectation collapses with them. The future you had already begun inhabiting is damaged. The ordinary world loses part of its layout. Even language changes. The word will starts sounding less solid. That is why grief can make simple tasks feel strangely unreal. You reach for the phone before remembering there is no one to call in the old way. You hear a joke and begin storing it for someone who is no longer there to receive it. You walk into a shop, pass a familiar object, and for half a second the world still arranges itself around sharing it. Then the arrangement breaks. People sometimes call this memory, but that is not all it is. It is love colliding with finitude at the level of habit. Your body, your timing, your expectations, even your sentences were built around another person's continued presence. When that presence is gone, mortality stops being an idea and becomes architecture. Rooms change, mornings change, the future tense changes. And yet this is also where something morally important can become visible. Love was never only a feeling you had in private. It was a way your life had been arranged around another life. That is why the loss hurts in so many directions at once. Not only because someone mattered, because your days had learned them. Mortality reveals that dependence with painful clarity. It also reveals why people who try never to depend on anyone do not become safer in the deep sense. They may avoid one kind of devastation. They also avoid the fuller kind of attachment that makes a life unmistakably real while it is happening. That matters because love is never only a feeling happening now. Love builds tomorrow in advance. It makes room. It assumes recurrence. It quietly places a particular person inside your future. That is part of its beauty. It is also why mortality wounds it so deeply. Death does not only remove someone from the present, it tears through the future forms in which they were already living. Every serious philosophy reaches a limit here. Buddhist thought can expose the fantasy of possession, but it cannot make sorrow disappear. Boethius can separate worldly goods from what fortune cannot touch, but he cannot make bereavement painless. The Stoics can warn us not to treat loved ones as guaranteed, but they cannot make love truer by making it colder. If you love, you become vulnerable to loss. There is no clean escape from that, and there should not be. A love immune to loss would not feel like love. It would feel managed, possessed, flattened. Real love includes exposure at the center. You let another life matter to the structure of your own. You let another person's existence rearrange your interior world. That is part of the joy. It is also why grief reaches so far. So perhaps mortality clarifies something severe and necessary. Love is not valuable because it can secure the future. It is valuable even though it cannot. If you really accept that, love stops being mainly a defense against uncertainty. It stops being the hope that nothing will be taken. It becomes a way of being present without demanding a guarantee as the price of care. That is hard. It means loving someone while knowing they are mortal, while knowing you are mortal, while knowing every routine you share is exposed. And instead of using that as a reason to withhold, mortality can turn it into a reason to become more exact. More exact in speech, more exact in gratitude, more exact in attention, more exact in forgiveness when forgiveness is due. Still, this is where sentimentality has to be refused. Mortality does not automatically make people tender. Sometimes fear of loss makes them possessive, or suspicious, or controlling, or emotionally evasive. Sometimes people start calling surveillance devotion. They want constant reassurance, constant access, promises no one can honestly make, and under that pressure, love starts choking. Not every seriousness about loss is wisdom. Some of it is panic wearing sacred language. The difference matters. Mortality can teach presence. It can also teach anxiety if fear takes command. A person can become more serious about love and less generous inside it, more guarded, more controlling. They start checking tone, reading delay as threat, asking for reassurance they cannot even receive once it is given. That is not depth. If there is wisdom here, it looks more like this: loving fully without pretending possession is possible. That does not reduce grief in advance. It may deepen grief because illusion falls away, but it also deepens reality. You are not loving a fantasy of forever. You are loving a mortal being in time. And that changes gratitude too. Gratitude is not just feeling lucky someone is still here. It is seeing that their presence was never something you were entitled to. Every human closeness exists under conditions it cannot control. That recognition can make you less casual. You listen more carefully. You say the needed things sooner. You stop treating affection as if it can be stored indefinitely without expression. You start seeing that neglect is not neutral in a finite life. This matters long before bereavement. Mortality changes love while both people are still alive. It can make apology less optional, reconciliation harder to postpone, pride more expensive. It can show you that emotional laziness is paid for in actual days, actual silences, actual missed chances to meet another person more honestly. You see it in scenes so ordinary they barely look philosophical. Someone asks how your day was and you answer without looking up. Your mother calls while you are halfway through something, and you let it ring because you plan to return it when you can be fully present. And then the evening fills, and then the week fills. A partner says, quietly, that you have seemed far away lately, and instead of staying with the sentence you defend your schedule. None of this looks dramatic. That is why it matters. People do not only leave us through death, we also fail them by meeting them thinly while they are still here. Mortality makes that harder to excuse. Once you admit there are only so many breakfasts, so many drives home, so many tired conversations at the edge of the bed, the usual defenses start sounding weak. I was busy. I meant to be kinder tomorrow. I thought there would be time to come back to this properly. Sometimes there is. Often there is less than you imagine. This is not a demand for permanent emotional intensity. No one can live like that. It is a warning against a common form of waste. We save our clearest language for funerals. We become articulate only after the door has closed. Mortality exposes that habit with embarrassing clarity. Why does praise become easier at the memorial than at the dinner table? Why does honesty arrive after loss more readily than on an ordinary Tuesday? If love is real, it has to enter those ordinary places. It has to sound like patience when you are already tired, like staying in the room for the hard conversation, like saying thank you before gratitude has to compete with grief, like letting another person finish when you already think you know the point, like refusing to win the small argument that costs more warmth than truth can justify. That kind of exactness is not glamorous, but it may be closer to love than many larger declarations, and it leaves us with the right pressure for the final chapter. If fragility cannot be hidden, what kind of meaning can still be honestly lived? A cup of tea goes cold while you are still talking. Years later, you remember the cup more clearly than the topic. Not because the tea mattered, because the person across from you did. An evening you barely noticed at the time turns out to be one of the last nights a whole version of your life was still intact. A walk home that felt forgettable becomes one of the scenes you keep revisiting because someone in it is gone. That is one of the quieter things mortality does. It changes the weight of what was already lived. But if we say that too quickly, it becomes sentimental. So it helps to stay exact. The shallow version says, death makes life meaningful because it makes us appreciate things more. There is some truth in that, but not enough. A person can appreciate beauty and still live evasively. A person can feel grateful and still keep their real life at a distance. The pressure is deeper. It has to do with the kind of meaning we keep demanding. We want our lives to matter, but we also keep wanting them to matter in a way that would be safe from interruption. We want love, work, loyalty, effort, memory, all of it to count. And beneath that, many of us still want a hidden guarantee that whatever counts will somehow be protected from time. Mortality keeps refusing that bargain. Meaning, for creatures like us, cannot depend on permanence. That is a harder sentence than it sounds. Many of us still act as if anything that ends becomes less real. If it vanished, was it solid enough? If it could not be kept, was it ever wise to trust? You can feel those questions quietly governing a life. They can make commitment look foolish. They can make every good thing seem insufficient because it does not solve time. You can see the damage in ordinary ways. A person refuses to love fully because they think restraint will protect them. Someone keeps one foot outside their own commitments so they can say they were never all in if the loss comes. Another person turns every good season into a private audit. How long will this last? What will this cost me? How much should I trust it? That posture can look intelligent from the outside. It can sound mature, but often it is just fear asking to be praised as realism. And fear of loss has a strange habit. It does not only prepare you for pain, it can make you half absent from the thing you are trying to keep. You start protecting yourself from an ending that has not happened yet. Meanwhile, the actual life, the conversation, the friendship, the work, the season you are in, keeps passing under that protection. This is one reason people can look back on a period that seemed stable and realize they were barely inside it. They were evaluating it, defending against it, bargaining with it, or waiting for stronger reassurance before they let themselves belong to it. Then time closes over that whole stretch. And what hurts is not only that it ended, it is that so much of it was met through caution rather than presence. This is why mortality can clarify meaning without making life neat. It shows that the demand for guarantee is part of what spoils presence. If you insist that only the permanent can count, then almost nothing in a human life will count enough. Not because your life is empty, because you asked it for the wrong kind of proof. A mortal life cannot give you security in that sense. It can still give you reality. It can still give you loyalty, depth, beauty, responsibility, memory, repair, courage, and love that mattered while it was being lived. That may sound modest when compared with permanence, but it is not modest when compared with the lives people actually lose by waiting for certainty before they commit themselves. What mortality strips away is not value. It strips away a set of conditions we keep trying to impose on value. That there will always be time later to become honest. That love becomes safe if we hold on hard enough. That something only fully counts if it cannot be taken. That meaning must arrive with certainty attached. When those conditions begin to fall apart, something else appears. Not comfort exactly. Something barer than comfort, but more usable. The difference between guarantee and meaning. Guarantee says this will last. This cannot be lost. This will remain under my control. Meaning says something quieter. This matters even though it is vulnerable. This act counts even if no one preserves it. This love is real even though it cannot be protected from grief. This effort is worth making even though interruption remains possible. That may be the only form meaning can honestly take for lives like ours. A conversation does not need to last forever to matter. A friendship does not need to survive every season to have been real. A life does not need to become invulnerable to have dignity. A day does not need to be exceptional to be well lived. Those are modest claims. Their modesty is part of their truth. They do not require pretending death is secretly a gift. I do not trust that language. Death is not a gift to the people it tears through. Loss is not redeemed just because someone can describe it elegantly. If we forget that, the whole argument goes cold. What mortality clarifies is not that nothing valuable will be lost. It clarifies that value was never waiting for safety before it became real. And that leaves one more demand on us. Fragile things require care. A parent protecting a child is not confused because the child is mortal. A doctor trying to prolong a life is not naive because death remains inevitable. A person trying to repair a damaged relationship is not foolish because the relationship cannot be made permanent. Fragility does not cancel responsibility, it increases it. You naturally move more carefully around what can break, which makes it strange that we forget this in the most important parts of life. We know how to carry a glass near the edge of a table. We lower our voice when a child is asleep in the next room. We remember to water the plant someone trusted us with. We feel the right pressure in the hand almost without thinking. Then we speak to each other as if marriages, friendships, parents, children, and our own inner life can survive endless negligence as long as our intentions are vaguely good. Mortality breaks that illusion. The important things are not sturdy because they are important. Often they are more breakable because they matter so much. A friendship thins through years of polite postponement. A conscience dulls through repeated small evasions. A life drifts out of alignment without one dramatic betrayal. You miss dinner because work runs late again. You say we should get coffee soon so many times the sentence stops meaning anything. You keep stepping over one inward warning because nothing is on fire yet. It happens by accumulation, by the joke you keep making after it stopped being harmless, by the rest you never take and then call virtue, by the work that gives you a public identity while quietly eating your private loyalties, by telling yourself one more season of neglect can always be repaired later. Meaning without guarantee is not a retreat from action. It is a refusal to wait for certainty before caring properly. It also changes what failure means. Many people still imagine a good life would be one in which nothing essential was ever lost. No effort miscarried, no love ended, no plan broke apart. But that would not be a human life, it would be a fantasy built by someone who wanted value without exposure. By that standard we start calling meaningful things failures simply because they remained vulnerable. A friendship that ends can still have been real. A work never finished can still have been worth beginning. A love that led to grief can still have deepened a life instead of cancelling it. Even a season that now looks damaged may still have held some of the truest attention you ever gave. Think about the strange way we talk after something breaks. We say, "What was the point if it did not last? What was the point if the relationship changed? What was the point if the plan collapsed halfway through?" But we do not talk that way about every finite thing. We do not stand at the sink after washing one cup and ask what the point was because it will be dirty again tomorrow. We do not hear one honest sentence from a friend and call it meaningless because the evening ended. We do not watch sunlight move across a room and accuse it of failure because it could not stay. In ordinary moments, we already understand something our larger theories keep resisting. An ending does not cancel a reality. A limit does not erase a value. So the question shifts, not whether a finite thing can offer eternal security, whether it can bear real value under the conditions it actually has. Once you see that, gratitude changes too. It stops being a bright performance. It becomes the recognition that something mattered, or still matters, under conditions where it could never be guaranteed. That kind of gratitude can live beside grief, beside fear, beside uncertainty. It is not the opposite of them. It is what becomes possible when you stop demanding that meaning arrive purified of them. This may be the clearest answer we can honestly give. Mortality makes life clearer because it strips away the fantasy of exemption. Then it asks whether we will still live, love, choose and attend as though vulnerable things can matter fully. That does not settle every question. It leaves the hardest ones open. Why one life and not another? Why loss falls where it does? Why some grief refuses to fit inside language? Why consciousness should appear at all and then vanish? Philosophy does not close those wounds. It cannot. But it can return us to a simpler task, to live without pretending we were promised safety, to love without pretending we were promised permanence, to make meaning without pretending meaning had to come guaranteed. If that is true, then we should not end with mastery. We should end with a life still exposed, still finite, and still answerable for how it is being lived. Most of the time, the limit does not arrive as a dramatic thought. It arrives when you hear yourself say later, and the word suddenly sounds weak. Later I will call. Later I will fix that. Later I will be more present when things calm down. Then one quiet night you realize things are not waiting for you to become ready. They are already becoming memory. That is the clarification. Not a lesson with a ribbon around it, just the end of a certain kind of self-deception. The call matters now. The apology matters now. The hour you throw away is not borrowed from some spare life you get later. It comes out of this one. That does not make every day solemn. It makes evasion more expensive. It makes love less casual. It makes attention feel moral. And that may be the sharpest thing mortality gives us. Not peace, not answers, a cleaner view of what our delays are costing. So the test is small. Do you answer the text? Do you stay in the room? Do you stop using tiredness as permission to become careless? Do you admit when a piece of your life has gone false? Mortality does not tell you exactly what to do next. It tells you that postponement is not neutral, and sometimes that is enough. Enough to listen better, enough to delay less, enough to stop treating your life like rehearsal. Maybe that is all the clarity we get. Not certainty, not comfort on command, just one ordinary evening seen properly before it disappears. And maybe that has always been the point.